was substantial risk to the public, both current as well as projected development zones, where we wanted to make sure that both the public was protected, but also that the board was protected, because ultimately, if the decisions are being made by staff, the staff is taking on the responsibility for board decision, and we needed, or we identified at the time, that there was a need to have a board-directed policy that would help guide staff decisions. This is the best process going forward, and it's certainly something that many, many local governments across the province of BC are starting to migrate to in terms of that process. So we would be within the first half dozen local governments in the province having a specific policy that provides guidance to staff.
And I think the short answer is no, there are no federal standards. Thank you. You have a follow-up?
Thank you. So others could rely on us, basically. It seems like there's very technical information that must be the same in most places, so, or similar. Is there a template?
I think that's when we request staff seek out best practices, I think that's what they do, is go out to other local governments. And so I would anticipate that other local governments may look to our staff, but through to Ms. Miller.
Yep, certainly we've got a long list of other local governments that are very interested in your decisions today in terms of how it guides this organization. We've had quite a few requests for a copy of the policy. I would suggest that every community is different. The risks in the communities are different, whether they're flood-based or steep slope or or seismic in nature, that the thresholds are different. We also have a very different profile in terms of how rapidly communities are developing. So, for example, North Vancouver has a life loss risk policy which is very robust, and all building has to meet one criteria. They don't have a criteria for existing buildings versus new buildings, and so we've recognized that 100% of the development in this region is already in place. We've got new development that could have a new policy, but we also have to be sensitive to the existing homes in place. So that's why the two-handed process.
Okay, Director Kuhn, you're going to have to take a back seat again. Director Staples, and then I'll go to you to close. I'm just going to the people who haven't spoken first.
I just wanted to clarify as well, some of this, as well as in response to some of the possibilities of changes in insurance based on some of the things like in North Van because of the house that went down. And so some of this is being preemptive in order for us to prepare for changes that are coming down the line at some point in time. Is that correct?
Thank you. And Director Kuhn to close. As long as he doesn't say anything that shoots a bunch of hands up.
Well, let's see. Just to comment on Director Nicholson's remark, yeah, it would be easy to attach the notes of the study sessions we had to the report. So we don't have to, I don't keep much of the material either. So then when something like this comes up and, oh, well, I haven't got the material, what was it all about now? So anyway, it would be easy. But the other thing I have is, I want to get into a detail here, and that is, let's look at that ALARP sketch here. So let's say, look at the ALARP between the unacceptable and acceptable. So let's say we had a risk tolerance of 1 to 10,000. Let's say, so there's an area in our CVRD that is generally looked at as a 1 in 10,000 risk. So it is acceptable if there's less than 10 people living there. So the moment you have more than 10 people living there, it becomes unacceptable, which kind of raises some questions. So you have this area, and there's 5 houses sitting there, 10 people living there, and it's 1 in 10,000, considered relatively moderate risk, let's say. So now somebody else wants to build a house there, and we're going to decline them on that because that goes over the threshold. How do we deal with that? Like, do we have real grounds to do that? Is it an arbitrary line that we're drawing? This, to me, it's almost like it's a computer program, and we're just following the computer program. That's what we're doing. And it irks me a little bit, because it's like technical, and well, we've got that line set, and sorry, you with your wife, you would be 12 people there. We can't accept that. You can't build a house, even though the risk for the individual house doesn't increase. It's just if there is a slope collapse or something like that,
So,
it affects more people. But the individual house is not any more risky. And so to me, that's, I don't know, that makes it kind of strange.
so to take the question out of that, though, was if there were 10 people in the risk scenario that you just described, would
Yeah.
the neighboring property owner be refused the right to build? So I don't know if we can answer that question through the
That would-
CAO.
You know,
There's building staff seems to,
I'll let Ian go and then,
That is a very difficult question to answer. It's a great question, but without more specifics, it would be very difficult to answer at this table.
and so what I had wanted to say was that, you know, this provides you with criteria for your developers, professional engineers to make recommendations on these types of developments. At the end of the day, you're still making a decision, and you're still going to be making a decision based on the best information that you have. This is intended to give you better information than you had previously. There's always going to be that line that you're going to have to walk as a board when you make a decision, but you have some defensibility in making decisions with more accurate information. And every circumstance is going to be different. I think these are generally designed for new developments, where you're looking at the number of people that will be in any development versus incremental increases to an existing development. Those are going to be challenging. Those are going to be challenging questions. They're challenging questions now, but this will, I think, will help to give you some framing in terms of making that decision in the future. But as Ian said, it's going to be very difficult to answer that very specific question here.
and if I may, and I'm going to come back to you, but there's also an engineer may recommend mitigation strategies that would get the risk level below a certain threshold to get the development to be more suitable. So I'll come back to you, and then hopefully we can get through trying to become engineers on an agenda item.
Right.
And I'll go to Director Sebring after, I
I'm
believe.
not trying to become an engineer.
No, I'll let Director Kuhn, then I'll come to you.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, I guess what I'm driving at is simply that if we have a certain area, let's say we're talking about a hillside, for instance, and yes, it's recognized that there's a possibility of some mudslide or something, relatively vague. There's a big difference then if you have 10 houses there or if you have 50 houses there. So individually, each individual house is not on an increased risk, but it's considered riskier based on that schedule. And that is kind of, it's hard to bring that to the public and to make the public understand that, well, just because it's a number of you, your house now is considered riskier, it's considered unacceptable. Even though individually, if that was the only house sitting there, they would be fine. But now, because there's 50 houses there, they're not fine. And to me, that is a theoretical value, and I question stuff like that, because reasonable thinking doesn't blend into that. And I have a problem with that.
Appreciate that. From a risk tolerance policy development, insurance would use things like that to develop risk analysis. So when it's in the context of a risk analysis, that's how you define where acceptable, unacceptable. I know never anything perfect, but I think our staff's already spoken to that. Director Sebring.
Just, and I'm not trying to be an engineer, I'm trying to understand process to what Mr. Carruthers said. You know, it's still up to the board to approve these things on a one-off. I guess my question or my concern is, with this policy, are there some of them that the board is just never gonna see because they just go over that arbitrary threshold?
That would be a question for our building department, but I would speculate that yes. I mean, clearly, there will be some that just will be outside of the acceptable threshold and for very good reason. And any prudent decision maker would not approve a development in an area that had that kind of risk associated with it.
And yet those same applications are coming to the board now.
Yeah.
That's, okay, thank you.
And you know, when you think about what precipitated this coming forward to the board was that we had done some recent hazard analysis across the regional district and identified some areas that were considered high risk. And the question was, okay, now what do we do with this? And the question came from the landowners saying, okay, you've identified this risk, now what do we do? And it really identified the gap in the fact that we don't, as a local government, have a policy around identifying risk threshold to assist not only our professional staff, the engineers, but you as decision makers as to when we make a decision and what it would be the acceptable level of risk. The reason that we've been able to piggyback on other local governments is that they've learned from experience. They've learned from tragic consequences in their communities where slopes failed and people died, and we're forced to look at this in a very deliberate way. We've had the benefit of learning from communities like North Vancouver and other jurisdictions around how to best deal with this in current engineering standards. It is a very complex document, and I think what you have to rely on is the fact that the consulting engineers will now come back with reports that are more defined, with more strict criteria. But at the end of the day, there will still be decisions that will have to be made, but it will be based on a policy.
Okay, I'm going to call the question then. It's been moved and seconded. All those in favor? Opposed? Director Kuhn opposed. The motion passes. Ms. Legault.
Mr. Chair, I wonder if I could just interrupt very quickly. I'm told that there is no video feed at the moment of this meeting and has been none since the start of this meeting. Can we find out what's going on, please?
So, Mr. Chair, if I can, that in fact is true. There was an issue between the conversion of the last meeting to this meeting. So it's not a feed. The tape is being recorded. The meeting is being recorded upstairs. So but it is not live streaming, and I don't know that staff will be able to have that rectified.
It's not staff, it's PrimeGov.
No, but if staff can deal with it being rectified, I realize it's PrimeGov. It's, yeah.
Oh, yeah, not today.
Yeah.
The meeting will be up tomorrow morning.
Okay, as long as it's recorded. Thank you. And I just actually, since we had a little break there, on that issue, I think we've made some improvements about how we link our previous reports to, and I think that, you know, the point is well taken around this specific issue. And I think that I see staff nodding that they'll endeavor to do that, because I know that adding the previous minutes from the meetings or agenda items that were being reported out to the board was very helpful as well. So thanks for that. Moving on, Ms. Legault.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The next item, R2, report from the Environmental Services Division regarding update to drinking water and watershed protection program, and the recommendation is for information.
Thank you. Is there any presentation, or are you just here for questions? There is a presentation. I knew that. I was just trying to grease the skids for you. We warmed you up with the previous agenda item, so Ms. Miller, welcome. Again.
Thank you very much. And I thought for this one, and I apologize for the last one, definitely have made the note with regards to that to make sure lots of background information without completely swamping you at the same time. We thought we would, in discussion with Mr. Carruthers, give the board a brief update as to where we are on this particular program and its development. As you know, we passed the regional function last election for the regional service, the drinking water and watershed protection function. In April, after the budget had been approved, we started discussions about how to move forward given the compressed timeline. At the same time, we also had the opportunity to start working hard to get some funding for the water supply, bulk water supply issue for Lake Cowichan. So there's been some modifications. So we thought we'd give you a bit of an update in terms of where we are right now. Briefly, 17 watersheds, 9 electoral areas, 4 municipalities, Islands Trust, which I'm not quite sure how to call them, another order of government thrown in there, 9 First Nations. 22 discrete water utilities and close to 20 ENGOs with interests in watershed management throughout the region. That's the challenge that we've got in terms of how we pull all of this together. And if you go back and you remember the goals that we had talked about, which is 2 key goals of sustainable water to meet our current and future community needs, as well as the protection of water supply at the end of the day. So those are the 2 primary goals that this function really spoke to when we went out to the public and what the public has supported. There are also a couple of other concerns around community pieces, right? We want resilient communities that have positive relationships, that have an opportunity to really see the value of water in how they develop. And linking that back to both the CVRD's visions within their OCPs, but also our partners' visions. And then the other is to recognize that we are not an entity unto ourselves. We can't do this on our own. We have to work with others in terms of meeting those larger objectives. So we have a couple of barriers, some challenges kind of throw in, and more than just the kind of the complexity of the playground that we're working in is that we've got 17 watersheds, a very, very large area, very, very different issues from the East Coast to the West Coast. And we've got existing regulations and barriers that we are certainly working with. The new Water Act has made a massive change, but there are still barriers that we need to work with our partners to kind of deconstruct and to move forward. So that's kind of where we are right now. I also wanted to talk a little bit about the work to date and the ongoing work that we're doing, because we're not starting from zero here. We've been doing quite a bit of work over the last few years. The development of schematic watershed management plans in some areas, fairly detailed, in some areas a little bit looser based on the risk and the issues that we're starting to see. Data collection, the development of a watershed atlas, which is really a foundational piece of information that allows us to look at the relationships between all of these different variables. Water quality and water quantity programs, and you'll be seeing we've got an RFP out right now across the region trying to establish a standardized water quality metric and process, as well as a schedule for updates, so that we're not comparing one community where there's been a lot of research done to another community where we really know nothing about. We want to make sure that we understand a snapshot of where we are at this point in time. Ecosystem mapping, because at the end of the day, under the new regulations, is not just water for people, but it's water for the functionality of the watersheds. And we see that right now in the Coxsahla, primarily with the order for cessation of withdrawal in some areas, and certainly on the Cowichan, with a very substantial, very expensive engineering works to pump water from a lake into the river to keep it going. All of this is based on a risk profile and a risk process. We also spent quite a bit of time looking at forecasted changes to population, changes to the environment, and what that will do, what the pressures are on the watersheds themselves. And so this is kind of the underlying piece of where we're going. The last and off to the right, you'll see it kind of stands alone, is this real piece around partnerships, the ongoing development of partnerships. And we've got a few of them here today, interested in the subject, interested in the issue. Do you want me to break?
Yeah,
and-
sorry,
Sure.
Ms. Miller, I usually like to save them, but I think
Absolutely.
Director Marsh wants to ask a question.
I'm curious if you could define what
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm curious, Ms. Miller, if you could tell me what you mean by high-resolution climate forecasts.
Always happy to talk about that subject. So what we wanted to know, it's really easy to say, climate change is happening. Well, what exactly does that mean? And the impacts in one area are very different than the other. And so we worked with the Pacific Climate Impacts Consortium to do downscaled climate forecasts for this region in some key areas. what were the changes to hydrology and temperature, and those are the two main drivers, and that really underlies a lot of the strategic planning that we've been doing around water futures and water supply issues. It also has some very substantial impacts on things like fire and species selection, and so when we did the work, we did it in partnership and invited, unlike many other local governments, we decided that this information needed to be used by the widest group of entities in our region. So the PMFL were here, VIHA were here because they're very concerned about the impacts on public health. Ministry of Agriculture, most of the First Nations, most of the engineering companies. So we've got very high quality, downscaled at a scale of roughly 800 square meters. That's kind of the cell size, and then we can kind of forecast out and say the impacts in Cobble Hill are going to be very, very different than they're going to be in the top end of Nitnat, for example. So that's what we mean by that. Important piece of information.
Director McGonigal.
Thanks. Just a quick one on the water quality and quantity. Does that include aquifers within the watershed system, or is it just the rivers, lakes, reservoirs, et cetera?
Thank you. So to date, we've been working with the province kind of generally across the region, trying to get an understanding of groundwater resources as well as surface water resources. And because we've had funding through the South Cowichan water planning function, we've done a phenomenal amount of work in the South Cowichan area on an aquifer by aquifer basis to understand the level of risk and pressure on those individual aquifers and their ability to regenerate in order to provide water for future development or even existing development. So multiple scales.
And just to follow up, I think that's been a stumbling block for a long time, is an inventory of aquifers and the health of those aquifers within the whole watershed and the impacts that climate change has had on them. So that piece would be very helpful within the decision-making process moving forward.
Thank you. Director Yanni DiNardo.
Thank you, through you to Ms. Miller. So working with others, in the playground and partnerships. So septic fields are Island Health, logging roads are PFL, and the ALR, of course, is the ALC. And the Cowichan, the Weir project as well. And so are we going to, so we're working with, they have the authority. They are on board to work with us in this. That's the partnerships that we've been making all this time. We have them on board with our water function.
Absolutely. I think every single one of our partners is absolutely thrilled that we now have a structured function. Up to this point in time, our partnership has been predicated on whether or not we were able to source annual funding or grant money to help leverage with them. And so, for example, when we're talking about groundwater, it allows us to partner with the province in putting observation wells in place. It allows us to partner with Ministry of Environment to look at water quality objectives, those sorts of things. And so it adds value to a very, very thin provincial level of information and allows us to be much more specific. And so they're exceptionally supportive of this process.
Thank you. Director Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm looking at the staff report that is the attachment on there, and on page 1 where it says background, there is the fourth bullet point says grants, providing grants to and financial support to entities approved by the board for the purpose of water and watershed protection. Can you expand on what they mean by the word entities?
Absolutely, and I'm actually going to get there on the next slide, if that's okay. Okay, perfect, and all right. Yeah, great timing, perfect, nice segue. So under the existing 131 function, we had been providing support through grant to the Cowichan Watershed Board, and we wanted to normalize that. So under this new function, there was an explicit line item that allowed us to provide supportive grants to other entities. didn't really define it yet, we're going to leave that open, that we're aligned to our objectives. We recognize that the CVRD is not a massive organization, nor do we want to create a whole new silo of water managers. And so as we move forward in the development of the 10-year strategy and work plan, we'll also be working with public entities, both at the federal and provincial level, as well as our municipal partners, First Nations, but also ENGOs. And so, for example, we've got the Shawnigan Basin Group, we've got the Cowichan Watershed Board, we've got the Green Blue Society, we've got the Lake Cowichan Stewards, we've got Salmonos, we've got Quamachan, we've got this whole group of very connected, very committed members of the public who have energy, who want to help us either collect data or do analysis, those sorts of things. And so as we go through the development of the 10-year strategy and the work plan, we'll be also, we'll develop the strategy, the work plan, but we'll also develop a standardized policy around grant allocation within the overall program. The process, the criteria, and the requirements that would be required in order to apply for grants. We'd probably also want to establish an uppermost percentage of the total functions value for grant giving, because it's very difficult to run a program if you've got a lot of variability in your resources. So, for example, you don't have a well observation network one year and not the next. So.
Thank you. Director Wilson, follow-up.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm still not exactly clear on this entities thing here. So somebody could form a group and try and get it approved by the CVRD and come to you for grants for research and that kind of thing on the aquifers, et cetera?
Through to Ms. Miller.
If I may, pretty much immediately the function was created by bylaw. There was a long list of organizations who were requesting funding. And that's very challenging for us to be able to say yes or no. We don't have a criteria. And that's a board decision around grant funding and grant criteria. So over the course of the next few months, and you'll see here a flow chart in terms of our process, if we start, and I don't see if you can actually, is there a way that the arrow can actually, oh, if I just go slowly, okay. So if we look at the project timeline from September to December, where we are now, we are just starting this process with a consulting group, Compass Resource Management and Econics, who are assisting us with the facilitation of this process. We're going to be working with them to make sure that they've got all of the relevant background information, some preliminary clustering of the issues so that we've got some issues lumped together. At the same time they're doing that, they're going to be reaching out to a smaller group of folks for telephone interviews to make sure that we haven't missed any key issues that should be included in the strategy. Not necessarily the solutions to those issues, but what should be in the strategy, and that includes municipal staff, key folks at the community level, provincial representatives. And as we move forward, we start to develop a preliminary work plan. We refine the options, so we've got some key objectives, how we're going to meet it, some timelines, the budgets that go with it, refine the list of actions and timelines. And this is where, for example, we may have other agents, whether that's the province or members of the community or other organizations, who are going to be leading on some of those actions. So we may not always be the doer, but the plan is what connects it all together. And then we've got a draft strategy that we'll be bringing forward to the various groups for discussion. And then sort of, as this goes through, there'll be quite a bit of conversation, especially when we get to the list of actions that will help inform the preparation of the grant and aid policy. Is it a grant and aid for operating purposes, or is it a grant and aid to meet the objectives of the strategy itself? and then there'll be the final report going forward. And so you'll see here that we've got a couple of different rows of consultation, so that sort of the general bundles of the consultation, identifying issues, the strategy, the reporting, and the recommendations. You'll see First Nations here are involved. This is a follow-up to the 2-year water governance discussions with the First Nations in our group. So we're reaching out to them again to say we now have this function, we're moving forward. What does it look like from your perspective in terms of involvement? What are your key issues? And that's really outside of kind of a public process. We want to make sure that there's a space there. We have what we're calling a CVRD steering group, which is made up of the project sponsor, the CAO, Brian Carruthers, myself as the project manager, and then our consulting team. And that's just to make sure that we stay on track, on target. If there are any substantial issues that come up, that they're dealt with at a very high level. We also have an oversight team, and we didn't want to make more work than was necessary for the key participants. But the oversight team is made up of key staff from the CVRD and municipalities. So that's the key planners and the engineers, because this data, this process, the function is ultimately in order to provide them with better information for decision making. And so we want to make sure that the plan, the strategy, the timelines meet and are in step with their needs and objectives. So nobody's kind of off doing something onto the side and not being informed, or vice versa. And lastly, we've got the sort of the most important group down at the bottom, which is the Technical and Community Advisory Committee. And so we've got draft list of representatives. We're currently reaching out to them to make sure that they're available, that they will be available for the whole part of the process instead of just coming in and out of the process. And those meetings will kick off probably mid-September at this point. And so that's made up of representatives of North Cowichan, Ladysmith, Islands Trust, and our other partners as well in terms of the province and ENGOs. So that's kind of the process. The real rolling up of the sleeves, the meat of the work is really down at the technical community advisory group coming back up again. At the far right-hand side, you'll see that we've got a public kind of session here, which is a public meeting, as a tentative, which is a presentation of the strategy. We didn't want to put an end date on that because ultimately the strategy is coming to the board. The work plan, the budget, all comes to the board. We want to make sure that the board is really comfortable with it before we go out to the public and say, this is what the 10-year work plan looks like, this is what the investment strategy looks like, and this is how we're going to be rolling it out in terms of priority projects. So that's where we are on the strategy at this point. Brian, I don't know
Thank
if you
you.
had-
Director Toporowski?
Thank you, Chair. I just had a question in regards to, you mentioned the First Nations and consultation to be determined, and then you mentioned something about that process not being public, and so I was just wondering if that was their wishes, or is that something that, can you explain that a little further? Thanks.
Absolutely. So for some of the First Nations, there'll be an invitation to participate on the Technical and Community Advisory Committee. So that's a very public process. There's recorded minutes, et cetera. But for some of the communities that are smaller and don't have a lot of capacity, we would work with their technical staff if they have it, or council if they don't have that available. We don't want to leave anybody behind. There's also not an end date to that. With this process, with the consultants, there's an end date to it of December. However, for the consultation with First Nations, it will continue through the life of the function, depending on the issues and the capacity going forward. So.
Thank you. Does that conclude your report? Thank you. So just a reminder to the committee, this is for information. So good to get some questions now, but I would contend that we don't dive too deep into rabbit holes until the time that staff can bring more detailed reports back. So Director Smith and then Director Sebring.
Through the chair to staff, can you explain a little bit more about the Technical and Community Advisory Group and how it will be formed and the qualifications for the group?
Ms. Miller. wherever you like, either return to your chair or at the podium.
I don't want to plant myself up there, so we'll avoid that. So at this point, we're looking at, we definitely want to make sure on that committee that all of the municipal partners are represented. Ultimately, they'll be using that information. That's quite important. We're also looking at geographic representation for the ENGO groups, just to make sure that there is an opportunity for regional input that is not just focused on one issue or one location. We have to also be careful. The consultants had advised us that, you know, having a technical committee of 100 people is really unworkable. So it's a challenge in terms of space and numbers. So we're currently working with them as well. We've put forward a list of suggested participants. The consultants are looking at that right now. And we'll be going back to that list because we also want to ensure that once someone's on that technical committee, that's not a seat that rotates out. There has to be continuity there. So again, a commitment to make the time to be part of that process.
Thank you. Director Sebring.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Not to get into the weeds, but I did notice something at the back end of the report about financial considerations that talks about a maximum of a 2.5% increase to the 2019 base. It's my understanding that the board direction there was in the overall budget. Is this inferring that we can see a 2.5% increase in the funding for this function the year after it was approved in referendum, or is this just sort of a notional statement that we might increase by 2.5%?
I put that through to Mr. Carruthers. The way I understood it was that this is, we've already taken a little bit out of that budget, and this would go up to the requisite level.
Yeah, I mean, the budget's going to depend on demands, and so I would have to ask Kate to speak specifically to the demands in the budget, but I think that's more of a notional item that we have up to 2.5% in our budget. I'm not sure what the proposed budget for 2020 is looking like for this function. We're well underneath the requisition limit now, so it's not.
Yeah, no, fair game.
Yeah.
Okay, I just wondered, because I know in community the question will be asked.
Yeah, thank you. Director Smith.
Thank you, through the chair. So I noticed that there's, that it says 2019 staffing and work plan adjustments due to the Lake Cowichan Weir project. So the Weir was not to be under this drinking water and watershed protection. I heard it spoken many times at the meetings stating that it would not be in this water. So is staff saying that they're unable to work in this project because they're busy overdoing still the Lake Cowichan Weir project? Can somebody just clarify that for me?
Mr. Carruthers.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. If I can clarify, and Director Smith is certainly referring to when we were out in the community engaging with the community on the drinking water and watershed protection. I think my comments may have been taken a little out of context. The comment and the concerns that were raised by the members of the public were that this function was going to fund the construction of a new weir for Lake Cowichan. And I was very clear that that was not the intent of this function, to be funding a new weir. Clearly the funding that's available in this function would not be sufficient to do that, but in spite of that, that was the case. The function does allow staff and the CBRD to work on a range of issues, water sustainability issues, bulk water supply, which includes the Cowichan Weir. So I think the statement there is that staff shouldn't be working on anything to do with the weir under this function, and I will suggest that that's never what was said. And in fact, our staff will be involved in a range of projects around water sustainability under this function. And we have been, staff have been engaged in the Weir project under the board's direction for many years, as many years as I've been here. And so I don't think there's a direct relationship of the work that we're doing now to this particular function. The current function right now is funding staff, or sorry, the 131 function. So yeah, I hope, I'm saying that to clarify those statements, that there's some delineation that this function has nothing to do with the weir. It was really around the capital funding of a new weir. So.
Quick follow-up, and then I'll go to Director Yanni DiNardo.
So twice I attended meetings, and that, at both those meetings, it was indicated that no funding would be coming out of this function for anything to do with the weir. That included planning and others, and that's what I heard at both meetings. That's what other people heard at those meetings, and now we're seeing it included here. That seems that that either the people that were attending those meetings were misinformed or misled. It's really frustrating to attend a meeting and hear that the weir is not going to be included in this funding, whether it's for capital projects or just for looking at the weir. I feel really disappointed because I know lots of people would not have supported this function if they knew that it was headed in this direction regarding the weir. There's so many areas in the population that the weir is an area that's federal, provincial. It doesn't fit into the whole CVRD, and this function doesn't have enough money to do all the projects that it needs to do for the whole CVRD when it starts pulling money into a specific project for investigating that.
Well, I'm clearly not gonna debate directors around the table on what was said during the campaign period. What I will say is that this function is yours. This function is yours as a board, and you make the decisions around how funding is allocated for this function. And if it is the board's desire and suggests that no funding from this watershed service will be used towards any aspect of planning for long-term water stability for the Cowichan, then that's the direction that we'll take from this board. So the work that we've been doing is a continuation of the work that we've been doing for 5 years, planning for the weir at the board's direction. The details around whether that funding comes from the watershed service is going to be at the discretion of this board. And if the board is uncomfortable with that, then they're ultimately making those decisions. I believe Ms. Miller might have had something to add to that.
So I've got a lot of staff hands and elected official hands. I would contend that it would be completely counterintuitive that a drinking water and watershed protection service wouldn't look at the issues around the largest single watershed in the region, but I'll go through to Ms. Miller and then Ms. Wenner for an update on their perspectives.
Perfect. I just wanted to clarify the comment in the staff report relates to when the 2019 work plan was approved by the board, there was no additional staff approved under this function. That is the development of the 10-year strategy and the effort and the level of effort required to do that would be drawn from existing staff, Dr. Hitami and myself. And because we had another program come up and there is only 120% of us, we, under that function, under that weir program, 100% of Dr. Hitami's time and my time is paid for by the grant. But we can't be in two places. And so the comment in the staff report simply says that because of the reallocation of staff time from what we would have done, we've now hired a consultant to do that work. And that's Compass Resource Management and Econics. And they're taking some of that load from us. None of this money is currently going at the direction of the board to any work to do with the weir. That work is being funded 100% by external grant monies.
Okay, thank you for that clarity. Thank you, and that was the staff finance comment as well. Sorry, I may have missed, I think I have Director Yanni DiNardo next, and I think I may have missed another hand down this side. No, thank you. And then Director Nicholson.
Sorry, thank you for the clarification as well, because I also heard that this would have nothing to do with the weir when we were during the function of the campaign function. So I just wanted to hear some more from staff on that. Thank you.
Thank you, and I'll go over to Director Nicholson.
Thank you. I guess, I'm not quite sure how to put this. I appreciate that staff are taking a very measured and thorough approach to developing a plan. At the same time, the reality is we have some, I think, growing water issues in the region that we need to start actually taking some action on. So the other day in Electoral Area Services Committee, we heard about concerns about aquifers in the Mill Bay area. We heard today about the Fisher Road situation. You all know about the Coxsila, I hope, where the farmers have been ordered not to irrigate their crops anymore because we're so short of water. And these water issues are groundwater and surface water. It's all connected. It's all one thing. And so we have to start, at the same time as we roll out a thoughtful, well-planned program, we have to start figuring out how we're going to triage these issues and address them and build, and our, you know, one of our fundamental pieces of work that we do is land use decision-making. We have to start bringing the information or lack thereof into how we make decisions here. And so it just, I would be completely supportive of going out. I thought it was not wise to have such a small funded program. You need more. You can't expect to roll out a program to address issues that are coming at us without additional staff person to actually carry the load. And I just can't believe that we aren't hiring someone right now to get to be a part of this process, to start carrying some of the load so that we can to start getting at these things. The Coxsila, we had a monitoring well as opposed to go in Bright Angel Park. Staff have not had time to work with our parks people over in another section of the building to figure out if they can get approval from us to put in a monitoring well in a CVRD park, in a watershed that's running out of water. Now, guys, let's stop arguing about who does what and what gets funded. Let's just get together, fund this service function to its max, because there is nothing more important than water, and get on with it. I am so frustrated with this petty bickering that goes on around here about this, what is really important, guys.
Thank
Sorry.
you. Yeah, and no, I appreciate your passion, but I've seen as strong passion on the other side of this issue as well about not being supportive of spending these funds at all. So I think we have to be wary of assuming that our perspectives are shared by everyone around the table or within the community. But I do appreciate the sentiments of what you're saying and the facts behind it. I think that maybe we're hearing more about specific issues that you mentioned, but I think those issues are prevalent throughout the regional district, and you know, I think it's understood that the amount of money we're talking about may not be sufficient, and that's a challenge. And you know, we see it. We have another group of very dedicated and patient people. Thank you for remaining here with us while we try and work through this. But we understand that it is a crisis. I do as the chair. I can't speak for the rest of the board. Do I have anybody that I've missed at this time? This is for information, and I suggest that that might be a good note. Not to put you on the spot, Director Nicholson, but to leave it on for this time, and we can all reflect and look at the information and look forward with anticipation towards the next steps. And I just want to say to the board at any time, and not to open a can of worms, and please don't make any motions right now, but we have the authority and the power, if we're very concerned about something and we can come to agreement to move some of these issues forward. I may be a pragmatist to a fault, so I really appreciate the measured process, as you did mention, Director Nicholson, but if we're okay to move on for now, I am going to call a break. We've been at the table for a couple of hours without a break, and I have a sense that the next issue will also be a passionate discussion. So I'm just going to call for to come back at 5:10, so about 8 minutes. Thank you.